July 1910. The SS Montrose is steaming from Antwerp, bound for Quebec. Britain has been gripped by a gruesome murder. Popular singer and former actress Corinne Crippen had disappeared, but then her dismembered body was found in the basement of her home, and her husband had fled with his young mistress. It was gory stuff, and the mild-mannered doctor had his face plastered on newspapers across the country. Captain Henry Kendall, of the Canadian Pacific Line, had read those papers, and as he strolled the decks of his ship and beamed at his passengers, he spotted two characters that immediately raised his suspicions. Gazing at them from afar, Kendall saw straight through the pitiful attempts at disguise. He knew it was really Dr. Crippen and his lover fleeing Europe. But what could he do? SS Montrose was now well on her way to Canada, and Scotland Yard's detectives were hopelessly behind. But Montrose, the humble passenger cargo ship, had recently been fitted with a very special piece of equipment, one that would change how ships communicate at sea forever. It would stop this murderer in his tracks, but it would go on to do much, much more. Guglielmo Marconi's device took the world by storm when it did away with wires and transmitted messages through the air itself. But arguably, the Marconi wireless system's greatest impact was on the ocean's waves, where it at last gave voice to ships which had relied for centuries on flags and rockets alone. It would save countless lives, and here's how it happened. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is how the Marconi wireless changed everything. The ocean is a cruel, harsh place. It's exactly the kind of place you don't want to find yourself alone. The brutal truth is that for hundreds and thousands of years, as soon as a ship and its crew left port, they were completely cut off from the outside world with no way of communicating. If disaster struck, or the ship ran into trouble, there was really no way to call for rescue. It was not uncommon for ships to depart and simply never be seen or heard from again. Ships did have some rudimentary means to communicate with each other, but only if they were in eyesight or earshot of one another. Ships' lookouts in the days of sail had been trained, often since childhood, to spot the telltale white smudge of canvas on the horizon and immediately identify what it was. Good lookouts possessed almost otherworldly abilities for determining what a distant ship might be, friend or foe, from extreme distances, simply from the general cut of the approaching vessel's sails or the way it lay in the water. Ships would exchange signals, military or company, to identify one another. Military signals during the Napoleonic Wars, for example, changed regularly to make it harder for enemies to impersonate one another. Combinations of flags or lanterns on different masts, along with gunshots at specific moments and in specific directions, could mark an approaching ship out as a friend. Signal flags are the most well-known form of non-verbal ship-to-ship communication. Each letter in the alphabet, along with the numbers 0 to 9, has its own colourful flag, combinations of which can spell out specific words, messages, or orders. Famously, at the Battle of Trafalgar, Lord Nelson signalled his fleet, "England expects that every man will do his duty." Except not every word was spelt out letter by letter. In a kind of Navy shorthand, a code devised by Lord Home Popham, each word had its own combination of signals to make it easier to message. All except, strangely maybe, for duty, which Popham had not assigned a combination, in which signalmen did have to spell out letter by letter. Flags could tell a lot about a ship. Obviously there was the national ensign, which showed ostensibly where the vessel was from, but flying the home colours upside down was an internationally recognised distress signal. At night, when flags couldn't be seen, ships could use lanterns or rockets to communicate distress or summon a harbour pilot. Even into the days of steam, merchant ships used company signals to identify each other. The White Star Line, for example, would have its ships display one green light, and fire a rocket with two large green starbursts, and then display a second green light when positioned off the coast of Ireland and awaiting the mail, in an intricate display that couldn't be mistaken for any other companies. Visual clues weren't limited to the ships themselves either. Shore-based telegraphs could position flags or markers in such a way as to spell out messages to each other or to ships at sea from long distances in a system known as semaphore. Channel markers and buoys were used to alert crews that they were close to land or shallow water. There were lighthouses. They could also make use of signals like bells, horns, or even cannons fired at regular intervals during foggy conditions. Ships maintained their own kinds of internal communication systems as well, and speaking trumpets were often used for inter-ship messaging. A speaking trumpet is essentially a megaphone and would amplify the voice of the user so it could be heard by the entire crew, but they could also be used to send messages to other ships provided they sailed close enough to one another. Now, while these more primitive means of communication obviously had their value, the simple fact of the matter is that they were too limited in use. If a ship was too far from another ship or the shore, none of these methods could be used at all. If there was bad weather or a dense fog, it was simply impossible to communicate. That was just the way it had always been. But then, technology began to intervene. Ships had been isolated at sea, but so too had entire continents. Nations communicated via convoluted mail lines relying entirely on dispatch riders and packet sailing ships alone. Urgent dispatches could take weeks or months to arrive. Often merchant ships were captured by vessels from nations they had no idea they were at war with in the first place. But this all changed with the introduction of the telegraph and the submarine cable. In the 1840s, the work of dozens of brilliant scientists who had worked on electrical telegraph since the 18th century culminated in Samuel Morse's device. The next decade, cables were laid which spanned oceans, and at last the continents could be linked by wire and talk to each other almost instantaneously. This didn't help ships much, but it was an exciting promise of things to come. For a device like that to work on ships, you'd need to get rid of all the wires and cables. A wireless telegraph. For the time, it must have seemed like science fiction, but the discovery of radio waves in 1887 changed the game, and the young Italian inventor turned his mind towards harnessing the power of this new discovery for a very practical purpose. Guglielmo Marconi was a young aristocrat who wasn't just content to sit around on his privileged haunches. He experimented in his father's grounds through the 1890s, just trying to send messages between a transmitter and a receiver, all without wires. In 1895, he was able to transmit messages up to 2 miles without any wired connection, and just a year later he filed his patent for wireless telegraphy. He demonstrated his system to the British Post Office just a month later, and the patent was accepted the following year. The era of wireless communication had arrived. To best appreciate the magnitude of this technological breakthrough, it's worth understanding, at least in brief, how it works. The first concept in wireless telegraphy that made it such a breakthrough is that the conducting medium was not a wire, of course, but simple air. Now this fact is why the technology would prove so crucial for ships. In wireless telegraphy's most basic form, a spark gap generator created a very large high voltage electrical spark. Now this spark caused rapid changes in electrical current, generating electromagnetic waves, or radio waves. Now these waves could travel through the air. To control the transmission, the operator used a Morse key to turn the spark generator on and off, sending short dots and long dashes in signals known as Morse code. Now the transmitter was connected to a tall antenna which radiated the radio waves into the surrounding air directly. The antenna was crucial because it allowed the energy from the spark gap to escape into the air as electromagnetic waves. The waves spread out in all directions, carrying the encoded message with them. At the receiving end, a similar antenna captured the radio waves from the air. The receiver contained a device called a coherer, an early type of radio detector. This clever device was a glass tube filled with metal filings that changed its electrical resistance when exposed to radio waves. When the radio waves hit the receiving antenna, the signal caused the coherer to conduct electricity, allowing the receiver to detect the transmitted signal. The electrical signals from the receiver activated a recording or signaling device. For example, the signal could control a Morse sounder which made a clicking sound for dots and dashes, or alternatively it could even drive a pen recorder which marked paper tape with similar dots and dashes, allowing the operator to read the message. The simplicity of this arrangement was key to its success. The more powerful the electrical generator, the more powerful the spark, and the further the transmitter range. This discovery and setup allowed for the application of Morse code to no longer be exclusive to wired telegraphs or signal lamps, but it wasn't without its quirks. For one, because the radio waves being sent physically in all directions through Earth's atmosphere, they were subject to atmospheric conditions. It meant that at night time, messages could be broadcast much further because the sun's energy would not be able to create radio wave absorbing layers like it did during the day. Then there was the fact that the messages were being sent out in all directions into the ionosphere and were detectable by anybody with their own receiving antenna. There could be no privacy. But still, a practical wireless communication device had arrived, and it brought the world closer together than ever before. As Marconi continued to fine-tune his experiments, his business grew. In 1897, he opened the first wireless factory in Chelmsford, England, employing around 50 employees, and over the next 2 years, he successfully sent wireless transmissions across the water to nearby islands. In 1901, Marconi received the first transatlantic radio signal. A station in Newfoundland, aided by a receiving antenna carried several hundred feet into the air by a kite, received a signal from Marconi's station in Cornwall, a simple 3 short dots, the Morse code for S. 2 years later, at Wellfleet in Massachusetts, Marconi sent a message from President Theodore Roosevelt to the English King Edward VII. Now, the news of this development came as a shock to the broader scientific community. Most scientists at the time thought a radio transmission could only travel in a straight line, and that it would be unable to bend with the curvature of the Earth. The signal was sent with a frequency of roughly 500 kHz and a power boost more powerful than had ever been used on a radio signal before. But aside from doing away with cumbersome cables and wired connection, it might have been difficult for all but the most forward-thinking to truly appreciate just what this development could mean for society. It would need to prove itself to be more than just a novelty. While Marconi refined his invention, soon its worth was demonstrated by a series of increasingly dramatic events. In December 1898, the British Lightship Service authorised the establishment of wireless communication between the South Foreland Lighthouse at Dover and the East Goodwin Lightship, which were 12 miles or 19 kilometres apart. It was just months before this setup was put into action. On the 17th of March 1899, the East Goodwin Lightship sent the first wireless distress signal on behalf of a merchant vessel. Elba had run aground on the Goodwin Sands. The message was received by the radio operator of the South Foreland Lighthouse, and with the message taken, the operator was able to summon the nearby town of Ramsgate to dispatch their lifeboat to the rescue. In the autumn of 1899, Marconi sailed to the United States at the invitation of the New York Herald's newspaper to cover the America's Cup International Yacht Race off the coast of Sandy Hook, New Jersey. Here, the first wireless demonstration in the United States occurred aboard a Puerto Rico Line steamship. Marconi left the United States for England in November 1899 aboard the American Line's SS St. Paul. It would prove to be a crucial voyage. Marconi and his assistant installed wireless equipment on the ship, and then a week later the world's first mid-Atlantic wireless message was sent. The St. Paul successfully sent a Morse-coded message to an English radio receiver some 66 miles off the British coast. The message read simply, "All well aboard, everything satisfactory." Just like that, the world of maritime communication was changed forever. Ships could speak with their own voice. Some ship owners jumped at the chance to have Marconi's equipment installed on their own vessels, but it was a slow rollout, and many ships still went to sea without a wireless radio installed. For one, Marconi would only lease the equipment to shipping lines and not sell it. Wireless operators would be employed by the Marconi company directly, not the shipping line as part of the contract. The cumbersome Marconi equipment was installed on ships by dedicated technicians who would physically mount the transmitting and receiving apparatus within a designated radio room on the ship, often located near the bridge. The truth is that many skippers and shipping lines were slow to take to the new technology. They trusted the ways of old that had been proven over the centuries of practical experience. It meant that even when it was installed, Marconi systems were treated more as a novelty, sending inane passenger messages back to shore, rather than communicating critical navigational information from ship to ship. A whole new generation of professional began to be trained, the curious creature known as the wireless man. These were often young, technically minded men straight out of school. They trained at the same schools, in the Marconi system, and they got to know each other very well. Over the airwaves, they'd cut in on each other's conversations with jokes, insults. They often spoke in their own kind of language. GTHQRL meant "go to hell, I'm busy," and GMOM, "good morning old man," was the standard greeting. But as the machine's usage began to grow, so too did its power. Reception was reaching up to 2,100 miles, or 3,400 kilometres on the most powerful shore-based sets, and a transmission from the Marconi station in Glace Bay, Nova Scotia, became the first radio message to cross the Atlantic in one go from North America. Marconi began building high-powered stations on both sides of the Atlantic to communicate with ships at sea. A transoceanic system was established where shore stations could pass messages onto ships within range, and the same message could bounce around the Atlantic from ship to ship until it found its intended recipient. With stations popping up all the time on shore and the wireless Marconi system installed on ships at last, it was only a matter of time before Marconi and his invention would be thrust dramatically into the public spotlight. In 1909, the Marconi wireless finally proved that it was more than just a toy. The RMS Republic was White Star Line's flagship vessel for the Boston service, and she was known as the Millionaire's Ship because of the number of wealthy Americans who travelled on her. She was an early adopter of the Marconi system, and it was all for the better because in January 1909 she began to sink fully loaded with passengers and crew. The Republic was sailing from New York City to Gibraltar and the Mediterranean ports when, off the coast of Nantucket, the ship found herself enveloped in a dense fog. Suddenly, out of the mist, appeared the Lloyd Italiano liner SS Florida. She struck the Republic hard amidships on her port side, and 2 passengers who were asleep in their cabins on the Republic were killed instantly, and so were 3 crewmen aboard Florida. Immediately, the engine and the boiler rooms on Republic began to flood, and she took on a bad list. But while the crew organised the passengers on deck, the ship's wireless operator, Jack Binns, became the first in history to issue a CQD distress signal. In the immediate aftermath of the collision, the Florida came to the rescue of Republic's passengers, but joining her was the US revenue cutter Gresham, which had responded to the distress call. Survivors were distributed between the 2 rescue ships when fellow White Star liner Baltic arrived on scene because she too had responded to the CQD. Then came the steamers New York and Lusitania. In the end, a good handful of ships were able to arrive in time to rescue all of Republic's passengers who'd survived the collision. On January 24th, the day after, the Republic sank, and she was, at the time, the largest ship to ever sink. But over 1,700 people had been rescued, with the only deaths being due to the collision and not the sinking. Over 200 wireless messages were sent over the course of Republic's sinking, coordinating a massive rescue effort between multiple ships. Of course, such a rescue effort would not have been possible without the installation of the Marconi radio. It was worldwide news. The new machine had saved hundreds of lives and showed just what it was capable of. Ocean travel, it seemed, had suddenly got much safer. The Republic's loss was the first in a series of famous, high-profile ship sinkings at the first half of the 20th century that really showed off the worth of the Marconi wireless. Soon there would come Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, and Lusitania. But in the years before all those tragedies, the Marconi wireless would have one more triumphant moment when it stopped a murderer in his tracks. And so we come back to Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen. He was a mild-mannered homeopathic physician in New York City who'd married aspiring actress Cora Turner. She was described as intimidating, and she lived an extravagant lifestyle when compared to her meek and mild-mannered husband. They'd moved to London in 1897, where she performed as a music hall singer and took on affairs with other men. Crippen, meanwhile, sold patent medicines, where he was aided in his business by Ethel Leneve, his young secretary, and soon she became Crippen's mistress. Then, in January 1910, Cora disappeared. Initially, Crippen explained that Cora went off to the United States on a visit, but suspicion grew shortly thereafter when Leneve moved into Crippen's home and was seen wearing Cora's jewellery and furs. The doctor was visited by Inspector Walter Dew of Scotland Yard, and he told the inspector that Cora had actually left him to live with another man. Dew actually bought the story, and he left, but just hours later Crippen had fled the country along with Leneve. A search of the house was ordered, and the findings were horrifying. Partial human remains were found in a hole in the basement, and forensic analysis identified the remains as those of Cora, thanks partly to the location of a distinctive scar. She had supposedly been poisoned and dismembered. In July, after months on the run, Crippen and Leneve boarded the SS Montrose as the ship steamed from Europe for Canada. Crippen's lover was dressed in bus clothes and pretending to be his son, and if the pair had travelled in steerage, more incognito, they might have got away with it, but instead they booked saloon class. The ship's captain, Kendall, had recognised the pair on his rounds and notified his superiors via the ship's Marconi telegraph system. He sent an outgoing message which read, "Have strong suspicions that Crippen London cellar murderer and accomplice are among saloon passengers. Accomplice dressed as a boy. Voice, manner, and build, undoubtedly a girl." Inspector Dew received the message and the chase was afoot. With the sluggish Montrose slowly making her way for Quebec, Dew boarded the White Star Line's Laurentic, which was much faster. He overtook the fugitives and there, in Canada, he laid in wait for the dramatic arrest. Or at least, it should have been dramatic. Instead, posing as the pilot, Dew stepped aboard, spotted Crippen, and walked up to him simply saying, "Good morning, Dr. Crippen. Do you know me? I'm Chief Inspector Dew from Scotland Yard." Crippen was resigned. "Thank God," he said. "It's over. The suspense has been too great. I couldn't stand it any longer." Returned to London, Crippen was found guilty of his wife's murder and was sentenced to death by hanging, while Leneve was acquitted, since she was just an accessory to the murder at most. If Crippen had made it to Canada and fled to the US, he would have got away with it, but thanks to Captain Kendall's sharp eye and the power of the Marconi wireless system, he was foiled instead and sent to the gallows. In the years since, Crippen's guilt has been debated endlessly, and efforts at conclusively identifying the remains that were found in the basement have yielded conflicting results. But still, the story was an Edwardian scandal that became front-page news around the world, and Marconi's telegraph was front and centre. For hundreds and thousands of years, sailors have taken to the sea in ships. It's just really hard to believe that for the longest time, any kind of meaningful long-range communication was just a thing of fantasy. The thought of sailing out to the open ocean for weeks or months at a time, with no way to call for help, sounds like a terrifying prospect, and yet that was just everyday life for all of our ancestors. That is, until Guglielmo Marconi put his mark on history. In the years after the Crippen case, the Marconi wireless system would play a critical role in saving thousands of lives in disasters like Titanic and the Empress of Ireland, all those during the First World War and beyond. Eventually, the Marconi wireless became requisite on most ships. No longer just a novelty, big liners were required to carry enough radio operators so that somebody would always be on duty. They became part of the ship's crew, and the transmitter was almost as important to the ship as its own keel. Guglielmo Marconi passed away at the age of 63 on July 20th, 1937, and as a tribute, transmitters around the world observed 2-minute silence in his honour. It was a fitting eulogy for the man who gave a voice to ships. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.